I do want to say, as someone who taught a course on women and art for 15 years at the University of Guelph, it's an absolute thrill to be part of this conference where women's art and the world of women artists is unfolding so marvelously, and to be part of the book that Sarah has so brilliantly put together. So thank you so much for including me. There's so much overlap, and there's so much to unpack in the work of these women. And so it's wonderful to have multiple voices speaking about each one. And so you've already seen the painting that I'm going to be discussing. Could I have the first slide? Which is Lilias Torrance Newton's Nude in the Studio. And as you've heard, it's famous for the scandal it caused in 1933, the pubic hair, the sandals, when it was hung by the Canadian group of painters, of which she was a founding member in their inaugural show at the Art Gallery of Toronto. The gallery's board of directors had it taken down immediately on grounds of indecency. I'm not going to focus on the reception at the time, which has been very valuably sketched in by both the previous speakers. I'm going to focus on what this painting might have meant to the artist and how we can read it today. The longer I lived with this painting, the more it appeared to me as her artistic manifesto, demonstrating her skills as a painter, her aesthetic commitments, and her vision for women's potential in the modern world. Torrance Newton was interviewed by Charles Hill in 1973 and said, "I've never done anything but portraits." Nude in the Studio proves that she was tempted into the wider field. So was her statement a confession of regret, or could we also see it as an avowal of her strength? The painting is quite clearly a portrait of a modern young woman, self-possessed and fearlessly naked in the artist's studio. It thus combines the two genres of the nude in the studio and the portrait. And we know something about who the model was, though alas, not her name. It was when I was teaching, Torrance Newton reminisced, this girl was working for me, a Jewish girl, and she was very anxious that I should paint her in the summer because I had a big drawing that she wanted. So she said, "I'll pose for you for nothing," for the amount of weeks needed. So although we don't know exactly what work the young woman was doing for the artist, perhaps paid as a model for the classes Newton was teaching in her studio, we know she was an art lover, valuing one of Newton's drawings highly enough to pay for it through exchange. Another clue to the model's identity is the portrait on the easel behind her. What an odd choice to have her head mask that in the portrait. And is it a coincidence that this portrait shows a Russian visitor to Canada, Andrei Stepanovich Ilyashenko, a musician trained at the St. Petersburg Academy, a composer of Eastern Orthodox liturgical hymns? Torrance Newton had painted him after his escape from Bolshevik Russia to settle in Brussels, and eventually he spent 2 years teaching in Toronto. Now, a large proportion of Montreal's Jewish population had come since the late 1800s from Eastern European areas, then under Russian rule. Others came in the wake of the 1917 revolution. The model's pose, obscuring Ilyashenko, claims for herself the background snowy landscape and its Russian monastery on a hill. Was it her idea to have this painting on the easel, or Torrance Newton's, or maybe the result of a discussion between the two? The model here presents herself to the gaze in what is clearly a deliberately set up pose, yet she's self-possessed and pensive, absorbed in her own thoughts. All these significant details suggest a degree of reciprocity between artist and model that is new in the painting of the female nude. As Torrance Newton later reflected, the impact of the sitter's personality on mine is what I paint. But this is also a portrait of Torrance Newton's studio, of her artistic practice. The plain floor, white walls, clean light, and figure placed frontally in a shallow space show her allegiance to an Art Deco aesthetic of simplicity, of machine-age veneration of materials and design. Note the modern armchair, the pattern of black lines on the textile thrown over it, the pattern's grid repeated in straps of the model's sandals, and the checkerboard of shadows on the floor, all echoing the angular lines of the model's arms. If we turn to Torrance Newton's self-portrait, we see an equally rigorous composition. The space behind the artist is defined by a picture frame on the wall, and the curves of a mahogany upholstered chaise longue behind her. It's interesting that Newton does not show herself as an artist, but rather as a poised society woman in her drawing room. This self-portrait comes from a critical moment in her life, her marriage to the young Canadian Army officer she had met when working for the Red Cross in London during World War I, came to an end soon after the Wall Street 1929 crash. His business as a stockbroker had failed, and he abandoned the family, leaving her to sue for divorce in 1933, the year of Nude in the Studio. She would now have to support herself and her son with her art. Both her self-portrait and the nude were bids to assert her status at the forefront of the Montreal avant-garde painting scene. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to do the unforgivable and show some men's art. So why paint a nude? Torrance Newton was vying for success in an art scene where this traditional artist's theme returned to favor, part of an international call to order and classical values in reaction against the chaos of World War I and the preceding modern movements. She and Heward, I see them almost joined at the hip. You know, both of them are responding to this. In 1927, a painting of a reclining nude by one John Wentworth Russell, a Canadian painter working in Paris in a saccharine academic style, was shown at the Canadian National Exhibition's art show in Toronto. It proved a huge and controversial public attraction. When criticized for thus endangering public morals, Fred Haynes of the Ontario Society of Artists and spokesman for the CNE's selection committee replied, "To have a fine exhibit, you must have fine paintings. And to get the finest pictures, you must take nudes." The men of Montreal's Beaver Hall group saw this as a challenge to create a specifically modern and Canadian nude. For Edwin Holgate, this meant placing her in the fresh air of a group of 7 landscape. Stanley Randolph Houghton puts her in an opulently furnished drawing room where she's fallen asleep, enabling us to stare at her unconstrained. Holgate's painting shows his worship of Cézanne, while Houghton's nude, with its smooth modeling and greater naturalism, owes more to the often flashily modernized classicism of the British art scene of the time. British painting between the wars has been little studied until recently, so there's been no awareness of its importance to the Canadian Anglophone art community and to Eric Brown, director of Canada's National Gallery. The NGC promptly purchased these 2 nudes. Next slide, please. There's more about the Montrealers and British art in my article in the catalogue. For now, I'll just show 2 English. No, sorry, one has been missed out. Thank you. I'll just show 2 English paintings well known in Canada at the time. Ernest Proctor's painting on the left was actually in Toronto's 1927 CNE art show, selected from the Royal Academy's summer exhibition of 1926. Its sleek Art Deco nudes quote a famous painting of Venus by the Florentine Bronzino in London's National Gallery. Dod Proctor's piece was voted Painting of the Year by the public at the 1927 Royal Academy and purchased for the nation by the Daily Mail. Her work proved the reclining female form could be sympathetically shown in a convincingly contemporary setting. She also painted female nudes, but I chose this painting because it was widely published and may have interested Randolph Houghton and Lilias Torrance Newton, as well as Prudence Heward when she painted Girl Under a Tree. It was in this context that Prudence Heward and Torrance Newton threw their hats into the ring with their monumental renderings of the female nude. Next slide, please. To highlight the distinctly new dimensions in Torrance Newton's nude in the studio, I'm showing her painting side by side with Christian Schad's 1927 self-portrait. Not because she would have known German Neue Sachlichkeit work, she didn't, but because it demonstrates that her painting and Prudence Heward's can stand alongside the most remarkable international images of the time. Schad's painting, like Torrance Newton's, shows a contemporary setting and a naturalistic rendering of a non-aesthetic nude. Schad declared that his paintings were not to be taken as literal, they were always symbolic. His self-portrait is a diagnosis of the times. Through the window is an industrial dysphoria. The artist sits beside a naked woman, possibly a prostitute, possibly his lover. Her grotesque face bears a scar and is an example of Schad selecting social outcasts for sympathetic depiction.
So Gerta, we're going to have to stop there because we have just time for Alma, barely, and no discussion.
Can I give you my last sentence?
Yes.
So Torrance Newton, like Schad, registers the social realities of the day, but signals a more benign environment than his. Her nude in the studio evokes a Montreal with cosmopolitan horizons, a refuge for the world, a place where women can fearlessly communicate their identities and exercise their talents.
Fantastic.